The following compilation features unsettling and spine-chilling tales sourced from Reddit's horror communities. Reader discretion is strongly advised. These narratives may contain graphic descriptions, psychological distress, and themes that could unsettle sensitive individuals. Proceed with caution, as immersion into these eerie stories may provoke fear, unease, and sleep disturbances. Enter this realm of Reddit's creepy horror stories at your own risk, as the line between reality and the macabre may blur within these chilling narratives. I never should have taken that babysitting job. The moment I stepped into that suburban nightmare, I knew something was off, but I needed the money. And honestly, how bad could watching an 18-year-old be? Turns out, pretty fucking bad. It all started when I saw the ad online. Babysitter needed for 18-year-old son. Great pay, flexible hours. I know what you're thinking. Why the hell does an 18-year-old need a babysitter? That's exactly what I asked Mrs. Dalvan when I showed up for the interview. Oh, Roberts. Special, she said, her smile never quite reaching her eyes. He needs supervision. Someone to make sure he takes his medication, doesn't leave the house, that sort of thing. I nodded, trying not to let my confusion show. The pay was incredible, way more than I'd ever made babysitting before. And as a broke college student, I couldn't afford to be picky. There's just one more thing, Mr. Dalvan added, his deep voice startling me. I hadn't even noticed him enter the room. The last few babysitters, well, they didn't work out. Left rather abruptly, I'm afraid, but I'm sure that won't be a problem with you, will it, Adriana? Something in his tone made me want to run, but I pushed the feeling aside. Of course not. Sir, I'm very reliable. And that's how I found myself alone in the Dalvan house on a Friday night, wondering what the hell I'd gotten myself into. The house itself was normal enough, a typical suburban two-story with a manicured lawn and a white picket fence. But something about it felt off. Maybe it was the way the floorboards creaked even when no one was walking on them, or how the air felt thick and heavy, like the house was holding its breath. Robert was in his room when I arrived. Mrs. Dalvan introduced us briefly before she and her husband left for their date night. Remember, Adriana, she said, her hand gripping my arm just a little too tightly. Robert doesn't leave his room after 8 p.m., and whatever you do, don't go into the basement. I laughed nervously. Why? You got a monster down there or something? Neither of them smiled. Mr. Dalvan just said, the basement door stays locked, for everyone's safety. And with that cheerful goodbye, they were gone, leaving me alone with Robert and a house full of secrets. For the first few hours, everything was fine. Robert stayed in his room, only emerging once to grab a snack. He barely spoke 2 words to me, just nodded and disappeared back upstairs. It wasn't until around 10 p.m. that things started to get weird. I was sitting on the couch, scrolling through my phone, when I heard it, a soft thump, like something heavy hitting the floor, then another, and another. It was coming from the basement. My heart started racing. I told myself it was just the house settling, or maybe a raccoon had gotten in somehow. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. I tried to ignore it. I really did. But the thumps kept coming, growing louder and more insistent. And then I heard something else, a voice, muffled but unmistakable, calling out for help. Fuck. I knew I shouldn't go down there. Every horror movie I'd ever seen was screaming at me to get the hell out of that house. But what if someone was hurt? What if the Dalvans had been in an accident and somehow ended up trapped in their own basement? I grabbed a heavy flashlight from the kitchen drawer and made my way to the basement door. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely get the key in the lock. The door swung open with a creak that seemed to echo through the entire house. I flicked on my flashlight and peered down the stairs. Nothing but darkness. Hello, I called out, my voice trembling. Is anyone down there? No response, just more thumping. Taking a deep breath, I started down the stairs. Each step creaked and groaned under my weight, and I swear I could feel eyes on me, watching from the darkness. When I reached the bottom, I swept my flashlight around the room. It looked like a normal basement at first. Washing machine, dryer, some old boxes piled in corners, but then my light fell on something that made my blood run cold. A door that shouldn't be there, hidden behind a stack of boxes. As I approached it, the thumping grew louder. It was definitely coming from behind that door. I hesitated, my hand on the doorknob. Every instinct was screaming at me to turn back, to run out of the house and never look back. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone needed help. I tried to turn the knob, but it was locked, panic rising in my throat. I pressed my ear against the wood. That's when I heard it. A soft whisper, barely audible help. My flashlight beam caught something, a thin crack between the door and the frame. I leaned in close, trying to peek through. An eye, a human eye, wide with fear, staring back at me through the crack. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. What the fuck was going on in this house? I was about to try breaking down the door when I heard footsteps upstairs. Robert, or Mr. Dalvan, or whoever the hell was really living in this house. In that moment, survival instinct kicked in. I knew I couldn't let them know I'd discovered whatever sick secret they were hiding down here, not if I wanted to make it out alive. I raced back up the stairs as quietly as I could, locking the basement door behind me. I had just settled back onto the couch, trying to control my breathing, when Robert appeared at the top of the stairs. "Everything okay down here?" he asked, his voice eerily calm. I forced a smile. "Yeah, all good. Just watching some TV." He nodded, his eyes boring into me like he could see right through my lie. Then he turned and went back to his room. As soon as he was gone, I let out a shaky breath. I knew I should run, should call the police, should do anything but stay in this house of horrors. But the image of that eye, pleading for help, was burned into my mind. And the reality of my situation hit me hard. I was broke, desperate. I needed this job, at least for a few more nights until I could figure out what to do. So I made a decision that would haunt me for the rest of my life. I decided to stay, to pretend I hadn't seen anything, to come back tomorrow night, and the night after that, until I could find a way to help whoever was trapped in that basement. Little did I know, I was walking right into a nightmare that was far worse than anything I could have imagined. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that terrified eye staring back at me through the crack in the basement door. But I had to go back. I needed the money, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone down there needed my help. The next night, I arrived at the Dalvan house with a pit in my stomach. Mrs. Dalvan greeted me with that same plastic smile. "Oh, Adriana, we're so glad you came back," she said, her voice sickly sweet. "So many babysitters find Robert challenging." I forced a smile. "No problems here, Mrs. Dalvan. Robert's a breeze." As soon as they left, I started planning. I needed to find a way into that basement room, but I couldn't risk getting caught. I spent the first few hours pretending everything was normal, checking on Robert periodically and watching TV with the volume up to mask any sounds I might make. Around midnight, I heard Robert's door close. Taking a deep breath, I grabbed my phone and the flashlight I'd brought from home. This time, I was prepared. The basement was just as creepy as I remembered. My heart pounded as I approached the hidden door, praying it would somehow be unlocked this time. No such luck. I pressed my ear against the wood. "Hello?" I whispered. "Is anyone there?" For a long moment, there was nothing. Then, so faint I almost missed it. "Please, help us." Us. There was more than one person down there. I fumbled with my phone, pulling up the lock-picking video I'd watched earlier. It looked so easy online. but my hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold the bobby pin steady. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, I heard a soft click. The door creaked open, and the smell hit me like a punch to the gut. Sweat, blood, and something worse. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing a nightmare. The room was small, maybe 10 by 10 feet, and it was full of people. Young women, mostly crammed together like sardines. Some were barely conscious. Others stared at me with wide, terrified eyes. "Oh my God," I breathed. "What the fuck is this?" One of the girls, her face gaunt and her eyes sunken, spoke up. "You're the new babysitter, aren't you?" Her voice was hoarse, like she hadn't used it in a long time. They always bring in a new one when they take one of us. The implications of her words made me want to vomit. I don't understand. Who are you? What is this place?" "We're the other babysitters," another girl said. "The ones who left abruptly." My mind was reeling. This couldn't be happening. This kind of thing didn't happen in real life, in normal suburbs with white picket fences. "We have to get you out of here," I said, my voice shaking. "I'll call the police." "We'll..." "No." Several of them shouted at once, then immediately hushed, glancing fearfully at the ceiling. "You can't," the first girl said. "They'll know. They always know. And then you'll end up down here with us. And the next babysitter will come, and the cycle will continue." "But..." A noise from upstairs cut me off. Footsteps. "Go," one of the girls hissed. "Before they catch you. But please, don't leave us here. Find a way to help us." I wanted to argue, to insist on getting them out right now. But I knew she was right. If I got caught, I couldn't help anyone. I closed the door, my hands shaking so bad I could barely lock it. I had just made it back upstairs when Robert appeared in the living room doorway. "What are you doing up?" he asked, his voice unnervingly calm. I forced a smile. "Just getting a glass of water. Thought I heard a noise, but it was nothing." He stared at me for a long moment, his eyes boring into mine like he could see right through my lie. Then he nodded. "Get some sleep, Adriana. Tomorrow's going to be a long day." As I watched him climb the stairs, a chill ran down my spine. Somehow, I knew he was right. Tomorrow was going to be very long indeed. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? The faces of those girls haunted me every time I closed my eyes. I spent the night researching, trying to find any information about missing persons in the area, about the Dalvans, about anything that could help me make sense of this nightmare. I found nothing. It was like the Dalvans didn't exist outside of this house. The next evening, I arrived at the house with a plan. It wasn't a good plan, but it was all I had. I'd smuggled in my laptop, a portable Wi-Fi hotspot, and a small camera. If I couldn't get the girls out tonight, I'd at least get proof to take to the police. Mrs. Dalvan greeted me with that same plastic smile. "Adriana, dear, we're so pleased you're settling in well. Robert seems quite fond of you." The way she said it made my skin crawl. As soon as they left, I set up my laptop in the living room. The camera pointed at the basement door. Then I waited. Hours passed. Robert stayed in his room. The house was quiet. Too quiet. Around midnight, I heard it. A soft click, like a lock turning. Then footsteps, coming up from the basement. I held my breath, my heart pounding so hard I was sure it would give me away. The basement door opened, and Mr. Dalvan stepped out, but he wasn't alone. He was dragging one of the girls from the hidden room. I bit back a scream. The girl's eyes were wide with terror, her mouth gagged. She looked right at me, silently pleading for help. Mr. Dalvan didn't notice me. He was too focused on his task, pulling the girl towards the front door. I knew I should do something, call the police, scream, anything, but I was frouncing in place, watching in horror as he opened the front door and shoved the girl into a waiting van. As soon as the door closed behind him, I sprang into action. I grabbed my laptop and ran to the basement. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely work the lock. But finally, the door swung open. "We have to go. Now!" I whispered urgently to the remaining girls. "This is our chance." They looked at me with a mixture of hope and fear. Slowly, painfully, they began to move. We were halfway up the basement stairs when the lights flicked on. Robert stood at the top of the stairs, a gun in his hand. Behind him, Mr. and Mrs. Dalvan smiled those terrible plastic smiles. "Oh, Adriana," Mrs. Dalvan sighed. "We had such high hopes for you, but I suppose you'll have to join our little family after all." I opened my mouth to scream, but before I could, something hard connected with the back of my head. The world went black. When I came to, I was in the hidden room. The other girls were gone. I was alone. No, not alone. Robert Saturday in the corner, watching me with those eerily calm eyes. "Why?" I croaked. "Why are you doing this?" He smiled, and for the first time, I saw something human in his eyes, something sad. "Because," he said softly, "I was the first Robert, the first babysitter, and now you'll be the next Mrs. Dalvan." As the meaning of his words sank in, I heard footsteps approaching. The door opened, and Mr. and Mrs. Dalvan stood there, sea-ringers in hand. "Welcome to the family, Adriana," Mr. Dalvan said. "It's time for your first lesson." But as they approached, something inside me snapped. I wasn't going to become another victim. I wasn't going to let this cycle continue. In a burst of adrenaline, I lunged forward, catching them off guard. I knocked the syringes from their hands and pushed past them, my heart pounding in my ears. I heard shouts behind me as I raced up the basement stairs, taking them two at a time. I had to get out. I had to get help. As I reached the main floor, I could hear them coming after me, but I had youth and desperation on my side. I sprinted for the front door, my fingers fumbling with the lock. Just as I heard footsteps on the stairs, I wrenched the door open and burst into the cool night air. I ran like I'd never run before, not daring to look back. I could hear voices behind me, but they grew fainter as I put distance between myself and that house of horrors. I didn't stop running until I reached a 24-hour diner several blocks away. With shaking hands, I called the police. But as I waited for them to arrive, a chilling thought occurred to me. Would anyone believe my story? And even if they did, would we be able to save the others before the Dalvans made them disappear? I knew one thing for certain. This nightmare was far from over. It's been 3 weeks since I escaped from the Dalvan house. 3 weeks of police interviews, nightmares, and constantly looking over my shoulder. I'm writing this now because I need someone, anyone, to know what happened, what's still happening. When the police arrived at the diner that night, I was a mess, bruised, disheveled, and babbling about hidden rooms and kidnapped babysitters. I could see the doubt in their eyes. But they took my statement and promised to investigate. They went to the house, of course, but by then, it was too late. The Dalvans were gone. The basement room was empty, scrubbed clean. There was no evidence of Robert, no sign of the other girls, nothing to corroborate my story. I insisted they check missing persons reports, look into the history of the house. They did, but it led nowhere. It was like the Dalvans had never existed. The police started to question my story. Was I on drugs? Did I have a history of mental illness? Maybe I'd imagined the whole thing, but I know what I saw, what I experienced. The terror in those girls' eyes, the sadness in Robert's. It was real, all of it. I've spent every waking moment since then trying to find proof. I've scoured social media, online forums, local news archives. I've reached out to every babysitting agency in the area, trying to find others who might have encountered the Dalvans. Yesterday, I finally found something, a post on an obscure missing persons forum, dated 3 years ago. It was from a woman looking for her daughter, who had disappeared after taking a babysitting job. The details were vague, but one thing stood out: the family's name. Dalvan. It's not much, but it's a start. Proof that I'm not crazy. That somewhere out there, the Dalvans are still operating, still trapping young women in their twisted family. I don't know what to do next. The police won't listen to me anymore. I'm afraid to go to the media. What if the Dalvans see it and disappear again? But I can't just do nothing. So I'm posting this here, hoping someone will believe me, hoping someone might have information that could help, and most of all, hoping to warn others. If you see a job posting for a babysitter needed for an 18-year-old, don't take it. If you meet a family named Dalvan, run. And if you're a young woman considering a babysitting job, please, be careful. Be so careful. Because somewhere out there, the Dalvans are watching, waiting for their next victim, their next Mrs. Dalvan, and I'm the only one who knows the truth. She fell asleep. That was all the opportunity we needed to defy the rule about Saturday morning cartoons. We could watch Disney stuff and Looney Tunes, but G.I. Joe, Transformers, Smurfs, He-Man and some other less memorable shows were not allowed, especially forbidden. However, the one we were told would corrupt our souls within a single viewing was the Dungeons and Dragons cartoon that ran from 1982 to 1985. If you're unfamiliar, the show was about some kids who get trapped in the dangerous and fantastical world of D&D. That's about how much I actually remember about it. I looked it up on Wikipedia recently. Apparently, it was pretty violent. A lot of 80s content was, though, wasn't it? The National Coalition. On television, violence pressured the FTC to put a warning at the beginning of each episode. They wanted it to say that D&D was directly responsible for people violently dying. The NCTV's request was soundly denied due to a total lack of evidence. That didn't stop a good chunk of the world, including my parents, from believing that evil lurked within the pages of Tolkien and, I don't know, under Smurf hats. All of it became banned from our household. And that's what made it so fascinating. Ironically, if everybody had just shut up, we probably wouldn't have cared about the D&D cartoon. They'd turned it into forbidden fruit. Plus, Looney Tunes got pretty boring after half an hour. Our younger brother, Matthew, was still a baby. He fell asleep on Mom, and she was out on the couch before the coyote got clobbered with his own anvil. John, my older brother by 3 years, looked at me before creeping to the TV. "What are you doing?" I asked. "Don't," I added when his fingers turned the dial. "We'll get in trouble." "Shut up, Pete," he replied softly. He crouched and watched the screen. I scooted forward and sat next to him on the floor. For the first time, we watched beyond the opening of the show. I vaguely remember a roller coaster or a ride of some kind. The cartoon kids got transported and changed into wizards and warriors. There's a little kid in a barbarian costume with a club, I'm pretty sure. I couldn't tell you what the episode was about because I couldn't focus. I was scared. Our parents said this exact cartoon was evil and could hurt us. At some point, I reached to change the channel. John grabbed my wrist and squeezed until it hurt. I could have woken up Mom. I could have screamed and hit my brother. I could have told on John and blamed him entirely for what we were doing. Instead, I rubbed my wrist and continued watching. That's about when the shot cut to a dark and cluttered room. Television was less refined in the 80s. Commercials were all kinds of crazy. So we weren't scared until we recognized the room as our very own unfinished basement. "That's my pennant," John said. He pointed at a yellow felt triangle sticking out of a box. The one I'd thrown up on last Christmas. Dad had kept it with some idea of restoring the accolade. We all knew it would rot down there. We joked about it. I didn't understand. Why is it on TV? John looked afraid. He didn't understand either. "I don't..." A man walked into the shot, his back to the camera. He was tall and had on a dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up. His hair was wavy and blonde like Bose from Dukes of Hazzard. He seemed to be looking for something, but not very hard. Faster than expected. He spun, and his face was close to the camera. Both John and I flinched and reached for each other. "Who do we have here?" He breathed into what sounded like a microphone, touching his mustached lips. His face moved up and down in the frame, and we saw only his eye at one point, and then his mouth again. John's eyes darted back and forth from the TV to our basement door. I was shaking so hard. The man grasped the camera, the sides of our screen, and stepped back so we could see his entire face. He looked like an actor with a practiced smile. For the rest of my days, I will never forget that face for its incongruity. The genuine mirth and the curvature of his lips were in stark contrast to his soulless blue eyes. A familiar creak came from the last basement stair. John covered my mouth as I began to yelp. The strange ordeal on the screen ended. D&D resumed. Stunned, we watched for a few more seconds before John turned the dial back to Looney Tunes. He crossed his lips for me to be quiet and crept over to the basement door. I shook my head. "No, John, no," I rasped. He ignored me as he disappeared into the kitchen and returned with a steak knife. With a trembling hand, he opened the basement door, lifting the handle to stop the hinges from whining. Then that 9-year-old boy went down the steps, intent on defending his family as the man of the house. Our dad worked every day but Sunday. The minute or so of total silence felt excruciatingly long, yet John returned without ceremony. He put the knife away and came back to the living room. "What happened?" I asked him. He shook his head. "Nothing. There's nobody down there. Must be some weird prank." "But that was our basement," I countered. He shrugged. "Nah. I mean, maybe, I guess. But probably not. A lot of basements look the same. Pete." Mom started to wake up. "But the pennant," I said. He ignored me. The rest of the day went by like any other Saturday. We played outside with the neighborhood kids. John and I didn't talk about the weird commercial. We certainly didn't mention defying the ban on popular cartoons. But I felt bad. Worse, I felt damned, like I was for sure going to hell when I died. For weeks, I prayed for forgiveness and became more anxious about dying. Fuck, I was 6 years old. The feeling never really went away, but I could sleep and play. I suppose the fear relented as the memory of the ordeal faded. I only know this to be true, however, because the terror came right back the night we found John sleepwalking. We shared a bunk bed. He always let me pick the top or bottom as I preferred. Those days I chose the top. Made me feel a little safer, knowing my older brother was between me and whatever monsters might be trying to get in. I never suspected him of being the monster. I recoiled into a ball when a face in our darkened bedroom appeared above the rail of my bunk. It was John, of course, but his eyes were nearly shut and he was muttering gibberish. He left our bedroom and turned on the hallway light before heading downstairs. Both Mom and Dad were in their doorway by the time I got there. It had been really difficult to get out of bed. John's strange behavior I immediately connected to our transgression. If that sounds ridiculous, I can assure you the events that followed only assured me of it. "What's going on, Pete?" Dad asked. Gently. I think he knew I was afraid. "John's acting funny," I said. He went downstairs. After exchanging apprehensive expressions, my parents went to find John. They didn't know I followed closely behind them, or that I felt very scared. This had everything to do with D&D and the man with the mustache on the commercial. We found John sitting on the floor, his nose close to the black TV screen. None of the lights were on. Shadows filled his eye sockets. I clutched the belt of Mom's housecoat. She nearly leapt out of her skin and gave me a stern look before pulling me under her arm. "John?" my dad asked. My brother slowly turned his head. His eyes were shut. The man with the mustache on the commercial, he droned before lifting his hand to point at the basement door. Almost at the same moment, a high-pitched scream came from below. Neither male nor female. That level of anguish is genderless. My dad put himself between us and the basement door. John's eyes snapped open. Mom pulled him close and kept me firmly entwined in her left arm. Dad went to the kitchen for his weapon of choice, the trusty black slugger behind the fridge. He had its twin upstairs beside his bed. Go upstairs. Bring Matthew to our room. Stay together. Lock the door. I'll call the police. Mom pulled us so fast. It felt like I flew. Matthew stayed asleep and fed while John and I stood guard inside with her. As the oldest, it was John's right to claim the bat. If he fell, however, it was my responsibility to take it up and avenge him. It didn't seem too long before Dad knocked at the door. It's me. Open up. Everything's fine. John nodded for me to open the door. Dad could be under threat, so I would open it, and John would leap to his rescue if it were required. Fortunately, it was not. Yet, we could see Dad's fear as plainly as the sweat on his skin. His smile took effort. Nothing in the basement. Did the police come? Mom asked. Go to bed. Boys, he said. Everything's fine. It was nothing. Neither of us believed him. We'd all heard that scream. But we obediently went to our bunks with no intention of sleeping. Our house was so small. Nothing spoken remained a secret. I don't think my parents know how loud they really are. I'll strip the extraneous from their overheard conversation. The key takeaway came from Dad. I didn't call the police. Why? Because we need a priest. He said priest, but he meant pastor. Pentecostals don't have priests, just pastors in regular clothes. The next evening we were sent to our rooms after supper. We didn't argue. We knew the guest coming was a pastor from the church. Not the senior pastor, but the other guy. A junior, I guess. With the sun still up, and our nerves about to exit our flesh, John and I listened for the pastor's arrival. Our parents admitted him, offered him coffee, which he politely declined, and led him to the basement. I recognized every noise in every stair. They must have been down there for less than a minute before we heard a rush of footsteps to the kitchen. I'm afraid, the pastor said, his voice shaky. This is quite serious. Do you think it's... Do not name it, the pastor warned. He laughed nervously after. Sorry, I need to call Pastor Shepherd. I know they sent me, but I have to tell you, this is, my first time. And, he trailed off incoherently, as though Shepherd really was the senior pastor's name. I didn't change it. Our parents came upstairs later with a box of Tim Hortons donuts and milk. It wasn't a bribe, but it certainly didn't hurt their chances of us following their instructions. Tim Hortons in the 80s was freaking top-notch. They actually made their donuts at the store in those days, and they were huge. I felt guilty for enjoying them. If only we hadn't switched the channel. The pastor has some work to do, Dad said, and he will be here through the night. Pray for him, and don't leave your room, no matter what, okay? We agreed. He called us good boys and left. I looked at John. He knew I wanted to tell them what we'd done. He just shook his head and went to his bunk. I tried to busy myself with toys, some books, and finally cleaning. If I could do something good, like tidying up, then maybe it would make up a little for my transgression. Hours dragged. John rolled over to face the wall and seemed to be asleep. It finally got dark out. I stood by the window and watched the street. I'm not sure how long before I heard the front door of our house open. The pastor strode quickly through the streetlight, his hands jammed into his coat pockets. He quickly walked out of sight along the sidewalk, looking back once as if to check for someone following. His departure made me afraid. The hurried exit looked a lot like retreat. Whatever thing might be in the basement had defeated him, and we were, once again, on our own against the forces of evil. All because of me. John too, of course, but he had given in to temptation first. It was my responsibility to pick up what he had lost, and I had failed. That meant, in my little head, too old for my age, that I must solve the problem. I took my pocket-sized King James Bible from my underwear drawer. Pentecostals have no particular Bible of their own. Next, I found the 282 piece of wood my father had carved a point on, my sword. Last, I took the tiny flip knife on John's dresser. Yes, I didn't ask to borrow it. but I figured he would have loaned it to me given the circumstances. Lifting the handle of my bedroom door to prevent the hinges from protesting my exit, I left my room, deftly avoiding the major reactionary noises of the hardwood floor. It was late. All the bedroom doors, except my own, were closed. I crept downstairs and saw the basement had been left open. A dim light pushed at the darkness of the first landing. One of the 3 dangling light bulbs had been left on. The cowardly pastor had neglected to switch it off during his flight. Right now, I write as if I wasn't deathly afraid, like some idyllic crusader about to earn redemption through holy resolve. But I was just a kid, and I didn't want to go down there. I wanted to go to bed and wake up on the Saturday morning before Mom had fallen asleep on the couch. The trick to the basement stairs was walking on the sides of each worn step. I didn't make a sound and landed on the concrete floor like a cat, so focused on where I stepped, I didn't see my colossal error. The pastor had never left. His white sleeves were rolled up to the bicep. He wasn't looking at me. I saw his back. He looked for something, but not very hard. I knew what came next, yet trying to run away was exactly the cause of his swift turn and approach. I accidentally kicked a box with my foot and alerted him to my presence. The speed with which he moved seemed unnatural because I took my eyes off him for a moment. Then he was there, very close to my face, and grasping my shoulders. "Who do we have here?" I shut my eyes, and he immediately released me. "Whoops. Sorry," he said. Sometimes I forget not everyone wants me in their personal space. I opened my eyes and he was still a bit too close, so I took a step back. His blue eyes weren't cold, they were worried. His smile was false, but it was for a reason. He wanted to pretend everything was all right. "You should go back up to bed. Pretty sure your dad told you not to come out of your room, pal." The pastor appeared more and more uncomfortable, grasping his elbows. "My dad?" I asked, bewildered and confused. "A 6-year-old boy." The man with the mustache cleared his throat. He needed a break. I sent him to the 7-Eleven for cigarettes. "I've been trying to quit." Wrong time to quit. After another prolonged, awkward moment, he noticed my armaments. "Why are you down here?" "Peter?" I held out the Bible. I don't know why. Before he could finish reaching for it, an invisible fire rippled across my chest. The pain was so sudden and intense, I screamed like never before. It felt like hot knives were crisscrossing my ribs. The shriek I'd heard the night of John's sleepwalking didn't sound exactly like the one I'd belted. But it wouldn't, would it? It's the difference between the voice you hear when you speak and when you hear it on recording. I whimpered and struggled to remove my shirt. The pastor knelt down and helped it off. He didn't ask what was wrong. He seemed to know already. "Pray, Peter. Pray." He encouraged me. I tried, but the pain got worse and worse with each word. "Don't stop, Peter. It hurts." The pastor prayed. "Dear God, please help this child." He held me down to the floor to stop my writhing. "In the name of Jesus Christ, leave this child alone." At once, the pain ended. We smiled at one another. I started to laugh, but he still couldn't flush all the worry from his expression. And then the real tragedy began. My dad came down the basement stairs. He stared at the man with the mustache and dropped the cigarettes and lighter where he stood. "Go upstairs, Peter." "Dad, Upstairs," he said. And I knew that tone. It meant, right away or else. The man with the mustache recognized what the scene looked like. Him over top of a shirtless 6-year-old and smiling, even if I didn't. Things are not what they seem." He stood up and backed away, patting the front of his pants. "I don't think we're quite done here either. Your son was attacked by it." Dad let the pastor's words die in a prolonged silence, while he waited for me to scramble away. I ran to the top floor and all the doors, except mine, were shut. Mom had woken up, but the shriek was not unexpected. The pastor had been called in for a reason after all. John sat on the edge of his mattress. "Why'd you have to change the channel?" I wailed. John just apologized and knew why he should. He shouldn't have done it. I shouldn't have let him. Our thoughts never strayed from the cartoon failure. The man with the mustache nearly died from the beating he took. Dad intended to kill him. Mom sensed something wrong aside from the suspected infernal presence. She interrupted the attempted murder, but not before the pastor was toothless and disfigured. I guess Dad's anger lessened enough for his brain to understand he couldn't go to jail. My parents put the pastor into the car and took him to the hospital. He apparently regained consciousness and didn't contradict my dad when he lied about a car accident. Mom and Dad didn't stay to see what happened next. The man survived. No charges or questions followed. We stopped going to church. No cartoons. Henceforth, we're forbidden. I didn't understand. I was happy. I didn't know until much later. But I don't want to digress from my family just yet and what ensued after that night. The months and years progressed and John and I grew apart. He developed an interest in our old, dusty basement and started hanging out down there a lot. "Want to see a ghost?" he asked me once. I never wanted to go down there again. Unexplained burning knives is a pain you don't forget. So John went alone, eventually moving his bed and dresser down there when he turned 13. No, the basement never got finished, but he made it somewhat more comfortable with a carpet he'd found on the side of the road and a TV. He played violent video games and listened to heavy metal. Terrible music, Mom said with a shrug. "Just a phase," Dad said. They'd been so thoroughly gutted of their faith. John didn't like me or any of his siblings anymore. He chased us away whenever we asked to play his Super Nintendo. I saw the drugs once when I snuck in. I think I was 14, before I could run away and tell our parents. He caught me and twisted my arm until I agreed not to say anything. "It's just weed," he said. But there were needles. Yet again, I didn't understand. A 14-year-old's drug knowledge should be limited. John died of an overdose shortly after being kicked out of the house. He was 25 and never graduated high school or had a job for long. No friends, girlfriends, or acquaintances attended his funeral because he'd made no strong relationships throughout his short life. And the saddest part, for me, was that nobody cried at his funeral. John had become so unlike his childhood self, so troubled, so violent. I think Mom and Dad and everyone were relieved he was gone for good this time. From that relief came extreme levels of guilt for my parents. Mom went to church again, but Dad refused. They fought over it. Combined with the tragedy of their eldest son, they soon split up. It was all so much to process. I just didn't for the longest time. What may seem like an obvious chain of causation to the day Mom fell asleep on, the couch didn't occur to me until I saw him again. What was left of him, that is. The man with the mustache on the commercial, in our house, doing his best to help 6-year-old me, is confined to a wheelchair. He can't move it on his own. His attendant pushed him to the edge of an apple bin at the grocery store and whispered softly, "These ones today, Pastor, mash up real good. Use the blender." It was a one-sided conversation. He stared at nothing, but I could never forget those blue eyes. All because we'd watched the wrong cartoon and something bad had given us a glimpse of the future. Bidding on abandoned storage lots is a lot more glamorous on television than it is in the flesh. On reality TV, the auctions are filled with colourful characters that you'd love to grab a beer with, and every other rusty door holds priceless collections of Civil War artifacts ready for sale. In the flesh and bone world, the storage hunters aren't quirky savants who can smell out a hidden boon a mile away. They're carrion birds, searching for a cost to benefit high. The real world holds significantly less treasures as well. When that mysterious door slides up, you're more likely to find an old wedding dress and stacks of poorly written love letters than something that's going to pay for your kid's college. Storage lot auctions aren't glamorous places, but they still manage to scratch that itch in the back of my brain. I used to gamble. I used to be good enough to do it professionally. Yet, as these stories go, Lady Luck found some other sob and my career was short-lived. When the bills came tumbling down, I promised my wife, under threat of divorce, that I would never touch cards again. That promise I have kept. When she found out I was betting on a different kind of sport, she was furious. Her finding out, however, coincided with me bringing back home a dusty lawnmower that worked without a hitch. That tempered her anger somewhat. When I returned a month later with a vintage Lego collection that fetched a nice enough price to warrant a vacation, her displeasure diluted into compromise. We made rules. I had a $300 budget for my hobby, and at the end of each month, I would have to walk her through what I found and how much it fetched. It felt emasculating to run everything by my wife, but she knows better than anyone that I need rules to not slide off to a dark place. For months, our rules have kept me from selling out our future again. For months, I have obeyed and kept on the straight and narrow and stifled my inner demons to keep my marriage afloat. Yet, old habits die hard. At my latest auction, I let myself get drunk off of the high of the chase. I broke our rules and have grown to deeply regret it. The start of the evening was far from interesting. In fact, it might have possibly been the most unimpressive showing I have seen at all my auctions. From the 10 or so lots that were shown, each had the makings of sentimental heaps rather than collector's items. I bid once or twice, but I never pressed my claim. My gut kept telling me that there might be something more worthwhile waiting for me deeper into the storage facility. In a way, in a very misguided way, my instincts were correct. The additional locks caught my attention. Along with the usual storage chain, there were 2 other heaps of metal attached to the door of the storage lot. The auctioneer informed us that the facility didn't have the keys to the other 2 locks, but that a bolt cutter would be provided free of charge to the highest bidder. The 2 extra locks piqued my interest, yet it was the man in the drab suit that cemented my need to own whatever was hidden in the storage lot. Heavy, rushed footsteps preceded him. The sound was so distinct in the tight concrete halls that the bidding was paused until the latecomer arrived. He must have been in his late 60s, or perhaps he simply treated his body very poorly. Both his grey pants and plaid jacket were a couple sizes too big for him, and he spoke in a thick Eastern European accent. It was obvious that the man wasn't from around here. It was also obvious he was not interested in bidding. As if the rest of the storage hunters were invisible, the man approached the auctioneer and spoke to him in raspy, quiet words. The auctioneer was wholly uninterested in whatever the old man had to say, but his temper calmed when the old man produced 2 keys that fit the locks. The storage space was his, he announced in broken English. There would be no auction. The auctioneer's face quickly hardened. The old man did, in fact, have the keys to the 2 additional locks, yet the facility locks were still left without a key. Without any proof of ownership, the auction would continue as planned. The strange man seemed to struggle with this idea. He kept repeating how the storage unit belonged to his colleague and how he was the next in line to own it. It wasn't until the bidding started that he gave up on arguing. The initial bid was $50. The crowd was happy to raise. In 10s and 20s, the price accumulated, and the old man watched in despair. When the price had climbed up to $150, with utter discomfort, the man in the drab suit yelled, $300. This, momentarily, quieted down the bidding. The additional locks had piqued my interest. The presence of the strange foreigner raised it further. It wasn't until I heard the desperation in his voice that accompanied the $300 bid that I truly had skin in the game, though. Trying not to think about my wife's face, I offered up $350. The old man's face grew twice as weary. Instead of offering up another bid, he started to argue with the auctioneer in panicked whispers. The auctioneer was deaf to his pleas. All he wanted to hear was a $400 bid. Eventually, with sweat pooling on his brow, the old man relented. He bid $400. I immediately bid $450. The old man didn't bother negotiating with the auctioneer anymore. Now, he was speaking directly to me. He insisted that he was the rightful owner of the storage space. It belonged to a research partner of his from many years ago. That's why he had the keys to the 2 additional locks. He demanded that I stop bidding and leave him to take what is rightfully his. The old man smelled overwhelmingly of sweat and cheap cologne. His breath was of coffee and cigarettes and the slightest hint of sickness. It wasn't pleasant to hear him beg, but I was far too interested in what was hiding behind those metal doors. In broken English, the man tried to change my mind. He couldn't. When that fact dawned upon him, he produced a bushel of crumpled bills out of his pocket. He counted them with shaking, spotted hands. He offered $640 for the unit. When our eyes met, I could sense the slightest bit of relief in his face. He thought he had outbid me. He thought the storage unit was his already. He thought wrong. I offered up $650. The old man had nothing else to bid. In a satisfying collection of seconds that sent a truckload of dopamine crashing through my skull, I became the new owner of the storage unit. The old man pleaded with me, with wet eyes and strained words. He begged me to take his money and leave the mystery of the storage unit be. His begging well surpassed the point of pity. It did not feel good to meet his eyes. I felt bad for the old man, yet I am a slave to the gods of chance. I would not ignore their boon. The old man was relentless in his pleas. When the manager of the storage facility suggested he might call the police, however, the old man quickly retreated. With the strange foreigner out of sight, he faded from my mind. I was too distracted with the contents of the storage space to spare him any more thought. I paid for the lot and signed all the necessary paperwork with the auctioneer, and then made my way through the labyrinthian maze of cement and metal to claim my prize. The lock had been left untouched for years, and the key had trouble fitting through the rust. Yet when it did, when that dirty door came up with a metallic groan, I knew I had struck gold. It was a big storage space, big enough to house a car with plenty of room to spare. The place was filled to the brim. Most of its contents were hidden beneath slabs of dirty cloth, but the storage unit was filled with vintage Pokémon merch. Every inch of the cement walls was covered in Pokémon posters and calendars. Every mysterious object draped in cloth was also covered in countless collections of Pokémon toys and keychains and plushies. The toys were worn and out of their boxes, but I could definitely get at least $200 for them alone. With the rest of the storage space draped in mystery, my gambler's heart fluttered at the prospect of inheriting a collector's collection. My expectations were high, yet when I ripped away one of the cloth drapes, I turned lightheaded. I was looking at a centrifuge, a high-tech, expensive-looking centrifuge straight out of a rich people hospital. A quick Google nearly dropped me to the ground. The thing was worth at least $1,000. My investment had definitely paid off. There was nothing that I wanted to do more than to rip down all the coverings and revel in my good fortune all at once. Yet the rush from the centrifuge was strong enough. I elected to take the lab tech home and pace out my dopamine rush from my earnings over the next couple of days. Though I regret to admit it, a plan hatched in my head. I was going to take the centrifuge back home and sing praises of my good luck to my wife. She would surely be happy about my return on investment, but there was no need for her to know about the rest of the storage unit. The fates had shown me good fortune. It was time for me to move past the silly financial limit my wife put on my hobby. The money from the rest of the storage unit would be my seed fund for future bidding, or so I thought. When I walked out into the chill night air, I found the parking lot to be completely empty. My wife was visiting her sister for the weekend, so there was no rush for me to get home, but it was getting late. I figured I would grab the dolly from my truck, get the centrifuge loaded up, and then surprise her with it Sunday afternoon. Had I simply loaded up the centrifuge, locked up the storage unit, and went back home, things would have turned out different, and I would have been richer for it. By the time I was back in the storage unit, however, the rush of winning had passed. I wanted another peek at the mysterious objects I had paid for. I promised myself I would only reveal one more object to myself, yet I do not have a good history of keeping promises. Under the first cloth covering, I found a chest-high microscope. Beneath the second, an expensive piece of lab equipment I could not identify. Beneath the third, I found a sort of incubator that had enough circuitry in it to suggest at least another $1,000. Had I turned back home then, had I even a shred of self-control, I would have gone home a wealthy man. Yet, I am a slave to the rush, and the 3 previous finds had whet my appetite, expecting another burst of dopamine. I ripped off the 4th cloth covering. I let out a shriek. As the dirty fabric gathered around my feet, all I could do was stare. I didn't understand what I was looking at, but somewhere deep inside of my chest, I knew I was witness to something patently against the laws of nature. The creature was suspended in a liquid-filled vat. It had 6 legs, a strange vine-like growth stemming from its back, and vaguely, very vaguely, resembled a cat. The thing was presumably dead, yet it was no less terrifying for it. Suddenly, the thought of being alone at the storage facility started to bother me. In an effort to distract myself with more expensive laboratory equipment, I tore down another cloth covering. Instead of priceless scientific instruments, I found a similar vat. I steadied myself enough to not scream, but I was no less terrified. The creature that floated in this one resembled a bear, yet it was no bigger than a raccoon, even in its small size. The floating beast terrified me. Its open maw was filled with a menagerie of misshapen, sharp teeth which looked like they could bite through steel. There was a thick web of skin stemming from the creature's paws, suggesting it once took flight. The beast was undoubtedly not the work of nature. The contents of the storage lot brought forth suggestions of dark science and terrible experiments. The dolly with the centrifuge was right next to me. I could have retreated back home, but instead, in terror, I stripped all the hidden objects of their obscurity. I found a couple more pieces of expensive-looking equipment. They gave me no joy. Even when I found a second, larger centrifuge, I simply went on to uncover the rest of the storage space. I found terrible creatures which will haunt my dreams until the end of time. A sort of crab creature with human eyes upon its shell, a snake with pairs of wings which covered its spine, a glob of grey flesh covered in bug-like eyes and twigs and flowers. There were about a dozen of the vats, and each inspired more discomfort than the last. Above each of the vats sat a sort of designation, GA07, GB028, FI004. The final covering lay on top of a vat, housing a genetic amalgamation I couldn't even begin to describe. Atop of the vat sat a coffee-stained Pokemon notebook. The hybrid encyclopedia, its title read in neat handwriting. It is only once I opened the notebook that I understood the markings that adorned the vats. They were names. Every page was dedicated to a different creature with rough sketches and neatly ordered notes. The notebook described many more creatures than were present in the storage unit. There were at least 100 pages. I tried to read the entries for the experiments that were present within the vats, but my heart was racing far too much to make sense of the tiny letters on the page. Just as I calmed, just as I centered myself enough to be able to make sense of the mystery I was entangled in, I felt a sharp prick in my neck. "Sorry," said the old man in the ill-fitting suit. "I have tried to warning you." Naturally, I was startled when I first saw him. I did, however, feel a semblance of relief about not being the only one in the presence of those strange creatures. The old man was considerably smaller than me and seemed harmless enough. I thought myself lucky to be in the presence of a man who knew more about these hybrids. That mirage of luck dissipated the moment I looked at the old man's hand. There was a syringe in it. Steadily, a tingling numbness spread from my neck. Before I could even register, I had been poisoned. I was crashing to the floor. With a great grunt of effort, the old man caught me and lowered me to the cold ground. Even though he had just stuck a syringe in my neck, his eyes were apologetic to the point of wetness. "This storage unit belonged to Crazy Man, Professor Willow. He is obsessed. I am sorry," the old man said, squatting down next to me. "I am sorry, but this storage is important. Willow must be ended. His early research is important. I am sorry." By then, the numbness had spread out all throughout my body, yet my neck continued to throb with renewed tingly beats. With each pulse, my vision grew foggy and the world beyond echoed with distance. I could register the old man depositing the syringe in his ill-fitting jacket and then fishing around for something else. Before his hand emerged again, he was nothing but a vague blur. "It is poison, but it does not kill. I am sorry. You will be fine. I am not thief. I am man trying to helping." Briefly, before my consciousness fully faded away, I sensed something being pressed into my palm. Then, with my thoughts stumbling into nothingness, I passed out. I woke to a phone call from my wife. She had just come home from her sister's, and I was nowhere to be found. From the sound of my raspy voice and my inability to articulate my words, she presumed I had been on a weekend bender. Without giving me a chance to explain myself, she hung up. I was stretched out on the cold floor of the storage lot. My cheeks were covered in drool, and I was next to what I presumed to be a pool of vomit. The fact that I was alive and able to feel my limbs provided a flicker of relief, but the flame was quickly snuffed out. The storage lot was empty. There were still vintage Pokemon posters and calendars over the walls, and none of the toys seemed to have been moved, yet all the expensive equipment I had celebrated so heartily was gone. The terrible monstrosities encased in vats were gone as well, but I did not mourn those. On the mornings when you wake up far from your bed covered in drool, it's usually the money that you mourn. I decided I would not tell my wife how I had spent my weekend. When I came home, we argued, and I let her believe that I had simply spent the weekend boozing. I did, however, insist that I didn't play any cards or gamble in any other fashion. She, after some convincing, believed me. I didn't want to tell my wife about the maddening hybrids. Partially, I did this because she wouldn't believe me. By the time I was back home, I was already working on trying to convince myself that it was all a fabulation anyway. The other reason why I didn't tell my wife, however, was that I didn't want to get into trouble. I did break our budget rule during the auction, and I knew that was a bigger sin than a weekend of boozing. It's not like she would ever find out anyway. The things which the old man told me as I succumbed to whatever paralytic poison he injected me with, I do not understand, and I do not care to explore. In one thing, however, he was honest. The old man was not a thief. When I woke on the floor of the storage lot, I found a crumpled stack of bills in my hand, $640 to be exact, with the toys and posters. I could definitely cover more than the $10 I invested. Though I have witnessed unspeakable crimes against nature, and though I am still recovering from the unknown poison, my finances were still in the black. Thank you for venturing into the darkness with us. If you dare to explore further, be sure to subscribe to our channel for more spine-tingling tales of horror and the supernatural. Remember, the shadows hold endless mysteries, waiting to be unveiled. Stay tuned for more bone-chilling stories as we continue to traverse the eerie depths of the unknown together. Until next time, may your dreams be free from the haunting echoes of our tales. Or perhaps not.